Robert Harris sat on the worn leather armchair in his study, the fading sun casting long amber shadows across the room. At 68, his days moved slower, more reflective, and much quieter than the fast-paced years of his youth. Life had calmed down, but it hadn't dulled his mind. On the shelves around him were dozens of books he had once breezed through in search of answers. Self-help guides, war memoirs, biographies of Stoics and sages. One book, however, had remained permanently on his desk. Its spine cracked, its pages lined with notes, underlines and symbols. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Robert didn't read it for strategy anymore. He read it to understand life. And more painfully, to understand all the things he should have learned earlier. It wasn't a book about battlefields, not anymore. It was about battles inside. A man's pride, his wasted time, his choices in love and war, and the peace he fights to find as he ages. It started back in his 20s. Robert had always been ambitious. Born and raised in Indianapolis, he came from a family of hard-working factory workers. His father, James Harris, would come home each night covered in grease, exhausted and quiet. Robert wanted more. Not just more money but more control, more say, more power. In college, he stumbled upon the art of war while researching leadership techniques. What began as an academic exercise turned into a quiet obsession. The lines were poetic but cutting. Know thyself and you will win all battles. At that time, he thought he knew who he was, a hungry young man who wanted to climb higher. But Robert now knew better. Knowing yourself wasn't a snapshot, it was an evolving journey. He had misunderstood Sun Tzu completely. In his early 30s, Robert landed a job at a prestigious marketing firm in Chicago. He rose fast. Too fast. He outmaneuvered colleagues, closed ruthless deals, and crushed competition. But something else got crushed too: his relationships. His first marriage to a sweet schoolteacher named Diane collapsed within 4 years. She had once loved his ambition, but in time, that ambition grew sharp and cold. "You treat life like a chessboard," she once told him before leaving. "I'm not a pawn, Robert." He didn't listen. Sun Tzu had said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." So Robert made sure he never fought. He just avoided emotion entirely. He won arguments by not engaging. He dodged vulnerability and prided himself on keeping everyone at arm's length. It took him nearly 20 years to realize that in trying not to lose, he'd never truly connected. That wasn't winning. That was isolation. As he read The Art of War again in his 50s, lines began to sting. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Back then, Robert thought he was always the smartest man in the room. But how often had he truly known himself? He had allowed fear to drive many decisions. Fear of failure, of vulnerability, of looking weak. It wasn't until his second marriage to a woman named Marlene that things began to shift. Marlene was different. She was assertive, clear, and emotionally intelligent. She challenged him in ways he found deeply uncomfortable. She often quoted Sun Tzu back at him playfully, saying, "You can't wage war on love, Robert." First, he resisted. He approached the relationship like a campaign: timing, control, power dynamics. But Marlene was steady and wise. And for the first time in his life, Robert began to reflect, not to win, but to understand. He remembered the quote, "In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity." After a turbulent few years, including losing his job and dealing with the death of his brother, Robert finally began to grasp what Sun Tzu had meant. Life was chaos. It wasn't meant to be solved, but navigated. The opportunity wasn't in defeating chaos. It was in learning to exist within it with grace. One of the hardest lessons Robert learned came at 61, when he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The prognosis was good, but it shook him. Mortality wasn't a concept anymore. It was a reality. As he lay in the hospital bed after surgery, he reread a passage from Sun Tzu. "He who is prudent and lies in wait for an enemy who is not, will be victorious." He realized his enemy wasn't cancer. It was time. The years that had slipped away in ego, coldness, and obsession. The conversations he didn't have, the friends he ghosted for work, the kids he didn't mentor because he was too focused on quarterly goals. Sun Tzu had been warning him all along. To win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. Robert finally understood. Life wasn't about competition. It was about clarity, about harmony. He had fought for so long. He hadn't known how to rest. He'd pursued success, never realizing peace was a far rarer treasure. Now retired, Robert began mentoring young men at a local nonprofit. Many came from broken homes. Some were fresh out of prison. Others had just lost their way. He shared his story, not as a cautionary tale but as an offering. He gave them copies of The Art of War, but with his notes scribbled in the margins. On the page that read, "Appear weak when you are strong and strong when you are weak," he'd written, "Don't confuse emotional honesty with weakness. Sometimes saying I need help is the bravest thing you'll do." Under "Let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt," he'd added, "Plan quietly, act with conviction, but always check your ego at the door." And on his favorite line, "Know thyself, know thy enemy," he wrote, "Most of your enemies will be parts of yourself. Know them. Don't hate them. Learn to sit with them. Only then can you grow." Robert's third marriage to Marlene endured. They lived in a modest home near the lake. He gardened, read poetry, and kept a journal. He had grown gentler, quieter, but his mind was sharper than ever. He now believed that real power wasn't control. It was the ability to let go. One day, a young man named Trevor, who had once been in his mentoring group, came back to visit. Now in his late 20s and running his own business, Trevor hugged Robert and said, "You saved my life." Robert smiled and said, "Sun Tzu did. I just helped you read between the lines." Trevor laughed. "I finally understand what you meant back then. About how most men learn these things too late." Robert looked out the window, the wind softly rustling the leaves. "We all learn too late," he said. "But the blessing is learning at all." As the evening set in, Robert opened The Art of War again. Not for strategy, not even for reflection, but for gratitude. Sun Tzu had lived centuries ago, in a world of swords and scrolls. But his wisdom had found its way across oceans and centuries, into the life of a boy from Indiana who thought he needed to win, only to discover the real victory was understanding. And now, in the twilight of his life, Robert Harris finally felt at peace.